Hello, hello. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your patience with us, and welcome to Ask Her. Again, waiting on a few more people, and then we will get started because we all have burning questions for you, and we're ready. Okay, here we go. We've got a lot of people who've joined. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Ask Her webinar. I am Mercy Chikawori, the Communications Manager at Washington Area Women's Foundation. Ask Her webinar is an interview series with women leaders, our partners, community members, and supporters who work tirelessly for women and girls. If you hear anything good today, be sure to tweet using the hashtag AskHerSeries. Use our Twitter, DC Women's Foundation. And if you're new to Washington Area Women's Foundation, we're a community-supported organization that invests in the power of women and girls of color in DC. In this region, we do our work through grant making and advocacy, which you'll hear more about. And we make sure we center the voices of women in color who influence policymakers, who clearly start movements like Opal, and who work on dismantling sexist and racist systems. Which is why we invited our good friend Opal today, who is a human rights leader, and co-founder of Black Lives Matter. So I'm gonna introduce you quickly, Opal, because we just wanna dig in. So Opal is one of the most influential human rights leaders of our time. As one of the 3 women who co-founded Black Lives Matter, a digital platform and chapter-based network, her name is etched in American history, and I'm sure African history too, because you are Nigerian. She's a feminist freedom fighter. She's respected for her track work of uniting communities and her thought leadership. She has many accolades I'll let you talk about, but most recently named one of Time 100's influential people. When she's not traveling the world or strategizing for social justice, you can catch her dancing, riding a bike, or adding to her Black art collection. And while she's done so many things, Opal has only just begun. So welcome, Opal.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here, and thanks for that warm introduction.
Of course, we're happy to call you a friend. I'm officially cool because of you. And happy Nigerian Independence Day.
Yes, happy Nigerian Independence Day.
Yes, ma'am. All right,
yeah.
So I think most of us know how you got your start. Well, actually, first of all, there's a lot going on, so how are you?
Well, I am all right. I'm all right. You know what? I am finding that I am, like many people, dealing with both, a lot of personal trauma, hardship, people passing away, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, to just watching things as they play out on a larger stage. And so like on the communal level. So it's, varying degrees of experiences that are happening. But I also find that I am having new opportunities to connect with both new and old friends and make new friends in this time and make connections that weren't necessarily there because of the necessity of the times.
Yeah.
And I'm also being a little bit more creative. One thing that I want to mention really quickly is that I helped to co-write a short film that came out today that was illustrated by Molly Crabapple and executive produced by Naomi Klein. So it's going to be online. You'll see it on Twitter and stuff like that. But it's a creative project and it looks at the future. And for me, it allowed me to stay a bit more hopeful, forward-looking, tapping into the resilience, tapping into the wisdom that so many of us have. So doing things like that has helped me to feel a bit more balanced with all of the real heaviness of the moment.
Yeah, I always think about you. I think about you all the time. I'm like, I can't complain. I don't know what Opal's doing. I feel like you're just always in the streets somewhere raising your fist on our behalf. So we appreciate you, but I'm fine. Lucky to work with an amazing small but mighty team at the Women's Foundation, and we keep each other grounded and whole. So thank you to the Women's Foundation staff. But again, let's just jump in because we have limited time and we're so glad you made time for us while you're not saving lives. How did you get your start really quickly? Again, we know about you, but clearly you started this global movement with two other amazing Black women. How did it start?
Yeah, I mean, so I thank you for asking, because I recognize that sometimes folks don't really know some of the backstory, where, you know, I might say it a lot, or I think I say it a lot, or other people might have said it, but there's a lot of assumptions that are being made. So I think it's helpful just to kind of clear that up. But I would say this, just because it's true. I've been organizing with communities for many, many years, and preceded my co-creation of Black Lives Matter, I was doing immigrant rights organizing from Phoenix, Arizona, you know, kind of cut my, my chops like in that space, and really came of age in that space, which if folks kind of recall, you know, this is, you know, DC conversation, but it's also a national conversation. You know, Arizona is kind of ground zero for the anti-immigrant movement. And as a Black person, as a Black girl, I could see how clearly the anti-immigrant movement was part of racial justice. Like it was just clear as day. And being the daughter of Nigerian immigrants, you know, I was directly impacted. My parents were almost deported when I was in middle school. I've had other family members who were in detention or were deported. And just so I've seen just how acute the impact can be on Black immigrant communities and Black people. And I just knew too much about, you know, racial profiling, driving while Black, being passed over for jobs, just, you know, you name it, in a place like Arizona where it's only 4% Black. So that got me motivated and inspired to organize, doing a lot of work with the Latinx community in Arizona, but then quickly realized that, you know what, there are Black folks who also can be organized and will organize and collaborate and build coalitions. So I did that, moved to New York, became the director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, the first national immigrant rights organization for Black people. Rocked with that crew for about a decade. But in my early years as ED, I helped to launch BLM because I felt intuitively that something more needed to be done. And, you know, thankfully, I was already working explicitly with a Black organization, right? So BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, we're already working with Black immigrants, Black refugees, African Americans. That was our mandate from day one, very much so a globally minded, Pan-Africanist, if you will, you know, Black focused organization across the country. So I already felt very comfortable and proud and just like knew that that was the case. But when George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin, I was gutted. You know, there's no other way to put it. Like, I was completely devastated. I have two younger brothers, and I have tons of god kids and like other young people in my life. And I just couldn't imagine that my goddaughter or others who were coming of age at that time would hear this story, see the court case, you know, play out on television, and think that this was going to be okay. You know, I wanted them to know, like, no, your auntie, your big sister wasn't going to let this thing go down like that. And that we were going to become the protagonists in this story. And we were going to begin to talk about things in a structural way, because this, you know, injustice of extrajudicial killing of unarmed Black people, if it's by vigilantes or by law enforcement, has been going on for far too long, you know, as you know. So that, so between that experience of both, you know, seeing the case, reaching out to Alicia, and when I saw her Facebook post and saying, hey, I want to build, you know, I want to buy the domain name, I want to launch an actual Facebook page, I want to do Twitter, I want to do all these things, but I want to invite all of the Black organizers that we already know from across the country to also use this platform and use this umbrella message. She was like, bet, let's do it. Let's like all kind of do our thing. I didn't know Patrice at the time, funny enough, but of course we got to meet afterwards.
You're besties
but
now.
we were in our respective places. Yeah, like we're all like a whole crew. We're in history together. So so that was, you know, kind of the beginning in terms of what inspired me. It was very much so personal and also very rooted in being unapologetically Black and having done that work and having known that it works, right? Like, it's fine, it's okay. And the notion that we were living in a post-racial society because we had our first Black president was just wrong, right? It was just wrong. And the truth of the matter is, racism, anti-Black racism was alive and well, and you might have, a couple people in certain key roles, but that doesn't do away with the structural impacts
Exactly.
of anti-Black racism in the society. So
Yeah.
this was a project to really address that,
Yeah.
first and foremost. So.
And I think you mentioned something really important in the beginning, is that people maybe don't know how the movement started. But the fact that 3 Black women got together from just being strangers and seeing each other in different walks of life is inspiring, right? And it's the reason we're having this chat is that Black women and girls matter. And a lot of the times Black women and women of color start these movements, and they often get co-opted by other people and for other reasons. So talk to us about being a Black woman in this space. So what does that look like for you? What kind of challenges do you face? Because I'm sure there are many.
Oh,
exactly. Let's exhale.
I'm like, oh, trigger. So
We're
much
laughing
tea.
to keep from crying, by the way.
Exactly, like literally laughing to keep from crying, because it's been quite the journey. Yes, we are on cover of Time 100 magazine, but that did not happen. It was a happenstance, right? There was very much so women mentors who championed us. So I'll just say this. So BLM started 7 years ago. We created the platform, mobilized to Ferguson when Mike Brown was murdered. From that, really created the global network where people who converged in Ferguson said, yo, we're here in solidarity. We see what's happening on the ground. And in fact, Ferguson is everywhere. And so we have a duty to be more organized wherever we are. And so that's where the chapter-based network started. But yes, as women, even with all of our labor, all of our intellect, all of our political thought and our track record, each of us 15, 20 years of organizing that leads us to this time that we're in. It's like, we didn't get here overnight. We're not, like random people who created something like on social media, and it was so cool. No, we were already organizing, and we saw the moment we were reading the signs and said, we need to make an intervention that is for our people, and let's pool our resources and our skills and see what we can do. We didn't know exactly how it was going to play out. I think deep down in our hearts, we absolutely wanted it to reach everybody. I know that in my heart. I know that I've always desired that since I was a young girl. And I realized people are looking at me funny. All of these challenges are happening. What is happening with my parents? I knew that from a young age that we needed more hands on deck. And because of my background in communication studies and doing my master's thesis on social media and different things, I knew that social media could be used in a particular way to engage more and more people. So that was kind of my passion. But what we found even early on with the creation of BLM, and as it began to have the first or second wave of virality, was that yes, people engaged it and took it on and took ownership, and that was in part what we truly wanted, and didn't really feel a sense of it's proprietary and we want to keep it. No, this is for us. Everyone. It's to move us. It's to, yes. And it's not just about extrajudicial killings. It's about the healthcare system. It's about education. It's about work, jobs. It's about all of these things. So it's not, we wanted it to feel that dynamic. And for people to take it on in their respective fields and in different industries. But I'll say, and what we found in the work was that because it was so open and we were so kind of, we're very generative with it, other folks would come along and assume, or even the press would assume that the founders, the creators of this thing was certainly not us. Certainly not the 3 Black women. It couldn't be. Yeah. How could they do that? How could something that reaches millions and millions of people be founded by Black women who were activists? It doesn't make sense. So you'll see that the press has gone to all kinds of largely, men cis, straight men, sometimes queer, but largely looking to men. And I think patriarchy I know patriarchy
Right.
continues to play this ever-present role in our society. And as a consequence, it plays out with our social movements and who gets to be seen as the narrators and so on. And so,
Exactly.
so much of even our reclaiming of our story and being kind of put back into the history of BLM being created was because other Black women championed us. They said, you know, enough of this. They literally pulled us aside and said, you all have to step up. You all have to, like, we're going to tweet on your behalf, or we're going to talk to so-and-so magazine editor. This is crazy what we're seeing. And not only that, they've had it happen to them too, right? So it's not that they're just saying it because they're upset, but they're like, no, we've seen this happen through various movements where Black women's contributions have been minimized and dismissed. So
and
not even just contributions, concerns. Yes.
Yeah, to that point, I was talking to a friend and she said the word nullify, and I was like, that's it. This is what happens to women of color, and especially Black women in all industries, all cases that were nullified from, you know, any of our contributions. We give so much and get so little in return. So it's important that you bring up having champions, which, shameless plug, at the Women's Foundation, you know, we have our Young Women's Initiative where we make sure, you know, we give them this stage and a way to use their leadership skills, because they're the leaders of today, so they can become amazing movement starters like yourself. But you also bring up a point about the media and what we see in terms of women. Our safety is a concern. And I think it's so important for people to see you on the cover of Time and see you in all these glitzy things and IG lives with Naomi Campbell. It's necessary. But we have to address the safety of women, because when the movement started, it was talking about a lot of Black men who've been killed, unfortunately. And a lot of the time they left out Black women or other women of color. And we created, you know, Say Her Name and all these things just to make the point of like, hey, it's not just this one group. So talk more about that when it comes to the work you're doing and centering Black women specifically.
Yes, I thank you so much for bringing that up, because that is the thing I think of everything that pains me the most is how Black women continue to show up time and time again, do the most and get the least in return. In terms of, you know, any kind of protection, you know, any kind of real support, like material support, and beyond. So I think, to me, it's the most confounding piece of all of this, where we know throughout history, just the quite literal labor from our bodies to our minds to our spiritual to our, you know, all of the modalities in which we show up and contribute is immense. Yet time and time again, from the larger kind of society, but also at times even within our own communities, we are often taken for granted, often dismissed, often really like kind of the mule for so much and not getting what we deserve in return. So I thank you for bringing this up. I think one of the things that folks don't know as much about BLM is that when we first started, so yes, Trayvon Martin and his life was the catalyst, right? We have young brothers, we have young people in our lives. It made the most, you know, it made sense to us and it moved us deeply. And we knew our society was traumatized from the court, the outcome. And then soon thereafter, though, Renisha McBride was killed. And we actually worked on that, actually did like webinars and gatherings and used the tools, the initial BLM digital platform to mobilize. And then, of course, soon thereafter, Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. And then we mobilized again, and that got the visibility, and that got the media attention. And so it was always part of our work. We've never, you know, dismissed or denied or minimized the violence that happens against Black women. I think about the great work of Andrea Ritchie Invisible No More, her text that really details the ways in which Black women and girls and femmes and gender nonconforming folks are impacted by state-sanctioned violence and by police brutality, you know, acutely. And I helped to do a blurb for the book. I love the book. I think it's so important. And it really is, I think, really instructive. I have it listed on my website as a resource. I think everybody should be reading it. Yeah. But it reminds me that we have to just do a much more intentional job as our social movements to foreground the voices of Black people who are at the margins, which oftentimes, despite our central leadership and our real labor and sacrifice, our concerns are oftentimes moved to the margins, or our contributions might be at the center and people are excited about it, but our actual concerns are at the margins. So my whole thing is, we got to move that all center. We need leaders like an Andrea Ritchie and those kinds of texts to be center and really instruct how we do policy work, how we do policy change, how we do movement organizing, how we resource our movements. Because if we do that, if we foreground and center those who are at the margins, we build solutions that impact all of us and that give the most benefit to more people. And so that's kind of my philosophy around the organizing. I'll just add one more point though, just to kind of nuance this conversation a bit, and because it's also on my heart and mind, and that is, as Black women continue to put themselves, women, femmes, GNC folk, like, as we continue to put ourselves on the front lines by no real choice, like we have to. Yeah. I also find that we get the most attack, right? So absolutely. Being on social media, it's not fun for me to be on social. People will see that like I'm not as active.
You have shown me your messages, and I wouldn't even know what to do. You don't feel safe when someone sends you messages like the ones you've received.
Exactly. You just don't. It's how can you? And it's disturbing because some of them will find out more information about you, or I might say something in an interview and then they kind of dig into it and they talk about your folks, your family, it's just disturbing, or they call your other colleagues looking for you. So there are a lot of things that we should be mindful of when we think about Black women in leadership and the support that they really need for their safety, which is both physical, but also like the emotional well-being. So I now, 2 months ago, got a therapist for myself for my birthday. I was like, you're getting yourself a therapist. So
I always talk about getting therapy.
I think we need, like, if we can get it, we should, right? Yeah. And there's different models on how to get it done, but I think, especially Black women in leadership deserve that, because we're dealing with so much, among other types of, I think, ways that we can, support and protect ourselves in other ways. But I think it's important for us to recognize. I also think there's real violence that's happening at the hands of police towards Black women protesters, right? Or Black women whose voices are being heard. So I think about Ijoma Oluo, who is a writer based in Seattle, and who essentially had somebody issue a false alarm saying that there was somebody at her house that was somebody at her house had held somebody hostage. And so there's a SWAT team. They call it swatting. SWAT team unleashed on her house. Same thing happened to Melina Abdullah in Los Angeles, BLM activist and BLM LA organizer. Same thing. They say, oh, we heard that there was a hostage situation. They SWAT, they run in, they try, all of these things happen. But it's a tactic that white supremacists oftentimes use and other detractors use to harass and quite literally bring harm to Black women who are prominent. So I think it's just stuff we have to keep an eye out.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you're saying that, because fun fact, we're in a pandemic. So even within the pandemic, where people are quarantined, you're still not safe because there are digital attacks and there are these other efforts that are happening, which is why at the Women's Foundation we started the Stand Together Fund to basically help fund women and women of color-led organizations who are small, who often, again, get put to the side or nullified, if you will, and don't get funding. And the biggest uptick we've seen, and part of the core of Stand Together Fund is sexual and domestic violence, because it's still happening within the pandemic.
Yes.
So talk about, and for everyone who's watching, please put questions in the Q&A box. We are about to pivot over to you. You can ask Opal whatever you like within reason, and we'll read it out to her, because we are coming up on time. We're over at 1:45, but talk about the pandemic. You know, how has that changed your activism? Talk about that quickly, and we'll move over to a few other topics.
Okay, yeah, I'll be a little bit brief, but I think the pandemic is one. It's just this time is one that will obviously go down in history as both being so devastating for our communities, but also revealing so much of what was already there. So many people, so many families were already on the brink, and this pandemic was the tipping point, right? Or the threshold that was, too much. But I want to go to your point about domestic violence, because I don't think a lot of folks know this, but my first kind of work out of college was at a domestic violence shelter, and I was volunteering all throughout college at DV shelters in Arizona, and I thought I was going to do that for the rest of my life. However, it was very depressing work and very hard for me to do that. So about 4 years into it, I had to transition to the immigrant rights organizing that I was doing. But it is a fact that there's been a huge increase in the cases of domestic violence. And this is happening in the US, but it's happening around the world. I'd be remiss, I was celebrating Nigeria earlier about like Independence Day, but they have a real sexual assault, a rape pandemic happening right now. One of the most egregious in the world at this time. And the rates have were astronomical as a result of, not as a result of the lockdown. The lockdown doesn't cause that, but people's biases and hate and injustice causes that. But the lockdown really exponentially allowed for that to happen. So I want to just raise that, because it's not just a US thing. I think it's important that we recognize that it's happening around the world, and just to keep an eye on that and keep those voices lifted up in this conversation.
Definitely. And for everyone, hopefully you're still tweeting, #AskHerSeries. I'm going to pivot to some of these questions because they're burning questions. We got a question around the black squares we saw on social media, and every company and their cousin saying Black Lives Matter and we've donated XYZ millions. Talk about resources. Like, what can philanthropists and corporations and organizations actually do that makes a difference for what you're doing?
Yeah, you know what? I truly believe that we have to resource those who are at the margins at this point. We have to resource creatively. We have to resource without strings and weird hoops to jump through. We have to trust the people, and we have to begin to create models that really reflect the times that we're in, but also a different we need to change the power dynamics within philanthropy. Let's just be really honest about that. So that's one. The second thing is that, from what I've begun to learn, is that I think it's 0.5% of the philanthropic dollars go to Black women and girls. And so this, to me, is once again egregious.
Yeah, it's not even 1%.
Not even 1%. It's 0.5%. I mean, it's disturbing. It's telling. We can see it in the outcomes, but also we can see it in the ways in which we're trying to bridge little funds that we had there and here and there to make something work, and we aren't able to be as effective as we could be. So right now, my main thing to folks is, no, your dollars belong there. Let's start supporting and resourcing those who've been left out of the equation for far too long. That's what we need to do. And I hear the point around Black squares and all of that. I think there are a lot of questions around performance and whether or not this is performative. Quite honestly, I'm not as caught up in that conversation as to whether or not it's going to be short-lived or long-lived. I think if people begin to, practice what they espouse, they believe, it's going to be an experiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Folks are going to need to do trial and error, and they're going to have to step it out and prove to us that they believe Black Lives Matter, right?
Yeah.
It's not just one thing to say it, but it's like, no, prove it. Behave like it, invest like it, divest like it, do what it would take to ensure that Black lives actually matter, and that there's more than just stopping the violence. No, repair the damage that's been done. Let's move on to those types of conversations as well. How do we repair the harm?
And in that same vein, I'm combining two questions in one. How can we get, Black women or people of color who work at organizations who may not necessarily care about what's happening to Black women and girls? How can we get them to care? And also, what can white folks in leadership do to support Black women and the work?
Okay, so I think I got the question. So it's, what should other people of color within organizations who might not care?
It said specifically white companies, and then in that same vein, what can white folks in leadership do to support Black women who work for them?
Right, got it. So I think there are a couple things, and a lot of times in both kind of corporate as well as philanthropic spaces, this question comes up, and my thinking on it is both, yes, look internal, look at what you're doing internally as a company, if it's both the education internally, if it's the executive leadership composition, and you need more diversity, to really reflect the world that we live in, to reflect the people you serve or you espouse to serve. Let's look at those things, internal composition, internal leadership dynamics, who's in your C-suites. All of those things are very, very important. The education that it takes to also shift the culture, but also to implement policies that look more just. That just has to be it has to be explicit, right? There's no wishing it into existence. No, there has to be real deliberate conversations, real deliberate investments within institutions, as well as what they're delivering externally, right? So there's an internal strategy, I think, that a lot of businesses and entities and organizations have to take, but also there's an external, what is that messaging? What is your product, your service doing to the community? How are we engaging consumers or others who are engaged? That also has to be examined in terms of messaging, reflections, and all that. But I would go even one step beyond that, and it wasn't raised quite explicitly here, but I will just add this, that I believe that people have to also look, or leaders have to look at the entire supply chain. So it's not enough just to say, oh, we're doing this one thing. No, how are you interacting with Black business owners along the way? Are you engaged in practices that actually cause harm to the earth? Are you engaged in practices that cause harm to other people in different parts of the world? Let's begin to look at our lives, as our organizations, even our transnational corporations. We're interconnected. So let's begin to take responsibility across the supply chain, across the influence that we do have.
Right. Don't just stay at the top, look at all sides and all factors. So we've got a few questions around voting, because clearly it's voting time. It's T- how many days left? There are a lot of questions around candidates and, what are you doing to encourage people to vote, and how can we keep our politicians accountable, if that's a thing, especially when it comes to people of color and our issues?
Yes. Right now, I think is probably the most important time in our lives to vote, right? I think this is the most important election of my lifetime. I'll say that. I thought the last one was, apparently it's this one, now that we know what's happened. But it's important that we all do whatever we can with whatever we have to ensure not only that people are registered to vote, but that people are able to access their vote, and that their vote and their voice is actually protected. I think that's the most disconcerting thing about what we're all witnessing in this time, where we see that there are unprecedented methods in which voter suppression is actively happening, and we can all see it. It's happened in the past, but we're seeing new methods even now.
Mm-hmm.
And the digital space is a huge space in which that's also occurring. So we need to also be invested both as individuals, but also if we have means to also support, if it's campaigns, support educational initiatives, support efforts that are going to support people if they have to go and stand in lines, if they need PPE, if they need food while they're out there, if they need to be entertained and encouraged while they're out there.
Yeah.
That's something that I'm a part of. I've been advising a number of groups. Yeah. And then the last thing I'm saying to folks, and particularly leaders of businesses and other entities, is ensure that your employees have the day off. It should be a paid day off. If the government's not going to do it, and in other countries it's a holiday, but if we're not going to give a full day off, more than the 4 hours that is oftentimes said, give a full paid day off, and ensure that your folks are able to actually vote, and don't make it stressful. And if the government's not going to do it, we as people with other types of organizations, as folks in running companies and beyond, are able to make that culture shift. And hopefully that will be the norm going forward, where we're like, no, election is a holiday, everybody can do it. And then of course, so many of us, and myself included, are encouraging people to vote early. BLM is doing the same thing in terms of campaigns, and a number of other groups that I've been advising are doing the same in terms of early vote.
Vote early, vote ASAP, vote for the immigrants who cannot, like myself.
And also, exactly. And for the immigrants who cannot, encourage people to vote like you've done, right? Like encourage folks to vote. I tell that to youth as well who aren't of age, right? Who aren't 18. I say, okay, that's fine. You can still door knock, you can still talk, make phone calls, you can still encourage people to vote. Civic engagement happens whether at the ballot or beyond.
And don't listen to the lies about, things that are happening with your ballot. Just go to vote. We have all of 1 minute left, so I want to read this comment. Thank you, Opal, for speaking on this piece about philanthropy and external matching internal. There's a requirement now to partner with organizations that mean what they say 24/7. Personal opinion can no longer be the answer. And I would say from the Women's Foundation, our call to action would be to donate and partner with local organizations such as ourselves. We're doing a lot of work with our Stand Together Fund, making sure sexual and domestic violence organizations, as well as care workers, are taken care of right now during the pandemic. Opal, we have so many more questions. Tell us what you want us to know. Tell us how we can keep in touch with you. I'm going to call you later.
Yes, please do. Yes, y'all, this has been amazing. I can talk about Black women and girls and leadership all day and movement building. So this is great, but I want to just encourage folks to, stay up with all of us, but you can connect directly with me online. I'm Opal, A-Y-O, Opal Aya, which is a Yoruba word for joy, Opal Joy, Opal Aya, on pretty much all my social, and then on Facebook. And also, I started a new digital platform. It's still new, but if you go to diasporarising.org, there's a lot of information about voting. It's just a quick link. We have it up there, and it's just like 2 minutes to register to vote, 2 minutes to check, or 30 seconds to check if you're registered. All of those kinds of really practical resources right there at everybody's fingertips. So I'm also just asking folks to share that, just because we need it to be as simple and easy as possible. And then otherwise, I want folks to also be sure to keep up with Black Lives Matter, and stop the disinformation that's out there by going directly to the source. Go to myself, us as leaders, but you can also find legitimate information at blacklivesmatter.com.
Great. And I'll be remiss if I don't leave us with this one thing. I know you're dealing with so much and burnout, and we see Black bodies all the time, and someone asked this: what can we all do to keep ourselves grounded? What are you doing to keep yourself grounded?
Yeah, so what I'm doing is staying up, or getting up early in the morning and doing some Pilates and praying. So I'm doing a lot of that, like to start my day right, really being in touch with my own sense of agency, my own sense of power, and making sure that from that place I can show up and be part of these conversations with my joy, with my peace, with my intentions being very clear.
And
so
thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll send a recording of this. Thank you, Opal, for all of the work you're doing. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.